And I'm very pleased to introduce our Vice President, Dr. Kevin Kairuki, who will give us some opening remarks before Professor Tahseen Jaffrey takes over to chair the rest of our discussions. So thank you very much in attending. You're all very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Mary Robinson and Mary Robinson Center for Climate Justice back to the African Pavilion. You may not know this, Mary, but many years ago, I watched you stride the political landscape like a colossus when I was a young engineering student in UK. So I saw you when you were president in Ireland, and I was very, very impressed. And I always found you amazing, so to speak. This is your second side event hosted by the African Pavilion. The first was at COP26. In both instances, the topic is gender-sensitive and climate-just financing mechanisms. Today is Gender Day, and we have extensively heard about challenges that women and young girls face because of climate emergency. As homemakers and primary caregivers, mothers, wives, and daughters, women and girls carry inordinately heavy burdens just because of their gender. At other gender or just transition events today, or during other events under the current COP, you may have heard heart-rending accounts of hardship and missed opportunities that women and girls face every day because of increasingly onerous circumstances occasioned by climate change. We have indeed become increasingly aware that the conditions to which women and girls are exposed make it eminently more difficult for them to access climate finance, which in turn makes it even harder for them to break out of the vicious cycle that ultimately locks them into poverty and hardship. As it is already difficult to mobilize resources for the small-scale context-specific activities that are typically implemented by small, micro, and medium enterprises, communities, cooperatives, and households. Suffice it to say that it is eminently harder for women and girls to access finance. This is because of the disadvantages women and girls face because of lack of education, traditional land and resource ownership rights, all of which render the majority of women and almost all young girls uncreditworthy. Furthermore, constraints because of the time they must dedicate to chores in their capacity as homemakers, primary caregivers, and mothers, including those associated with collecting firewood, fetching water and cooking, etc., only disadvantage the women and children even more. Through the bank's work on climate adaptation, application of our own gender assessment procedures, and in partnership with the Climate Investment Funds, Global Affairs Canada, and the Mary Robinson Center, our bank's climate change team has become increasingly aware of these issues. Accordingly, I am very pleased to report that we have started several initiatives that will contribute to efforts to spotlight this issue with a view to improving access to climate finance for our women and girls. Briefly, and I know Gareth will probably address this, sort of elaborate more on these incentives or initiatives in the latter intervention, we are in the process of financing 10 capacity building projects focusing on gender and climate through the Africa Climate Change Fund. Moreover, we are in the process of committing $100 million in loans to public and private sector projects that address also gender and climate issues. Finally, we are developing the adaptation benefits mechanism, which will enable otherwise unbankable groups and individuals, including women and children, to borrow more money, from climate adaptation projects. And climate just financing mechanisms, not only out of sheer fairness and equity, but also because women have demonstrable success track records. In this regard, statistics show that women are more likely to reinvest the benefits of projects in their families and communities. They are more likely to pay back their loans, and when freed from the tasks such as collecting water and firewood, they make substantial contributions to the well-being of their families, and enhance the resilience of their communities. As our president, Dr. Adesina, often says, and I'm sure, Mary, you've heard this before, when women succeed, we all succeed. Let me conclude with this note of optimism. I thank you for your kind attention, and as I hand the mic back to Professor Jeffrey.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Kairuki, for your opening remarks. And on behalf of the Mary Robinson Centre for Climate Justice at Glasgow Caledonian University, it gives me an honour and great pleasure to be hosting this event this afternoon. And joining me to unpack some of the things that have just been mentioned by Dr. Kairuki, in terms of fairness and equity, this is the heart of the matter here. This is what is really important, and that's why this discussion is so vitally critical at COP27. And to join me in this discussion, I'm joined by no other than our patron of the Centre, Mary Robinson, who will be giving her remarks and her thoughts on the subject matter. But also we have Gareth Philips, who's manager of Climate Finance and Environment Division at the African Development Bank, Merci, Ansa, Director of Tropen, Ghana, and Stephen Cansuck, who's a team leader on environment and climate change at the UNDP, but is also one of our very first doctoral students at the Centre at Glasgow Caledonian University. And this conversation really builds on some of the pioneering work that he's been doing over the last 6 years. And I have to say, it's been a long journey to try and get here, but it's absolutely vital that his data and his evidence comes to light at this particular COP, particularly when we're talking about climate justice and loss and damage. As mentioned, we know that the bulk of finance goes to mitigation projects, but the vast quantities of finance that are mobilised, they're huge amounts of money, 10 to 15 million US dollars. And we also understand that adaptation, although things are changing and there are new mechanisms, the Climate Adaptation Fund is open, there's the Global Centre for Adaptation, amongst others, mobilising finance. At the heart of the matter is that these huge amounts of money are not reaching those women and girls who need it the most, simply because they're too big in terms of quantity and not able to be mobilised correctly by those on the front line. But to kick off this discussion, first I would like to turn my attention to Mary, first of all. And this is a conversation that we've built on since COP26. We started this discussion then, and what I think would be really important here is to get your sense of, from the work that you've done in Uganda, have you seen or sensed any change? Mary, have you seen or sensed any change in terms of mobilising climate finance for women in this last 12 months? Mary.
Thank you very much for the question, Tajine. But just before I respond to it, can I just warmly congratulate Stephen. I'm delighted that you're going to be a doctor of climate justice, part of the Mary Robinson Climate Justice Centre, and I really look forward to hearing how your work is going in Ghana and what you've learned, because it's great to see. And I know you've lots of master's students, and and I'm very proud to have my name connected with such a fine centre, which I did help to launch, I have to admit, many years ago.
Thank you, Mary.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But to come to your question, this is a moment when there are things happening on finance, big things happening, and women are pretty vocal on some of those big things, like Mia Motley, with her Bridgetown initiative, which the elders very strongly support. Kristalina Georgieva is doing her best in the IMF. So there are women who are thinking about finance a lot. But to your question, does finance get to women on the ground who are building resilience in their communities? I do not see enough of it yet. I have a kind of suggestion.
Mary, can you hold the mic to your...
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have a bad habit. I think I learned this from Archbishop Tutu. I wave my hands too much, and I use the mic, you know, like a... Yeah. Anyway, I'll try and be very good now, and now you can hear me. It's just I get excited about this subject. I get very annoyed when I see such interesting work. I saw it in Uganda just literally a few weeks ago when I went there. Very good projects being done by women, entrepreneurial, very exciting projects. And yet, each one of them could do 10 times more if they had the resources. And they had no prospect of the resources. They didn't know who was getting the money, where the money was going, what was happening about it. So there is a problem about visibility, transparency, accountability, and also not enough money anyway is going. We don't have a properly dedicated gender climate fund, hopefully a feminist climate fund that would deal with this. So that's the problem.
In terms of a climate and a feminist climate fund, that sounds hugely pioneering, very novel, but so much needed right now. And I'm delighted that you've mentioned a feminist climate fund, because I'm not hearing that at all. And from bringing in the climate justice lens to this, how do we mobilize a climate just fund?
Well, I would make a suggestion to the African Development Bank, because I really like that this is our second meeting. We're building, we're understanding each other, and I want to hear my panelists. But can I just make one suggestion, which actually isn't in my notes, but I was thinking of it when I was coming here. There are bodies that are funding women on the ground. The Global Green Grants Fund, the Global Fund for Women, the Climate Resilience Fund, the Daughters for Earth have come into, with quite a lot of money, come into the field, and they're funding women at local level. This is not nearly enough, but if the African Development Bank, apart from what you're going to tell us and what you're already doing, was to convene all those who are funding women on the ground, I am sure you could learn very good lessons from each other. I'm sure you could exchange experience. I mean, I know, because I'm patron of the Global Green Grants Fund, they trust the women that they're funding because they hear from civil society people who give them good advice. We can tell you that group of women is doing good work, and they don't have to report. They don't have to spend ages filling in forms. They're trusted. That's one model. You know, there are different ways of, but the main thing is, it is very frustrating to so many women in Africa that are doing exciting things that they would like to grow. This is the real thing, and I'm sure Merci will talk about this too. They want to grow their projects. They want to, enlarge, and they cannot get the financing, and then everything is undermining them, including the climate crisis. Yeah. So I think a convening of those who are actually doing, which is nearly enough, by the African Development Bank would be a step towards what I would dream about, a feminist climate justice fund, and that got money on the ground to women. Thank you.
Mary, thank you for that. And just to take that conversation forward, Gareth, I'm going to turn to you. What Mary is advocating there, and what she said, this convening of meetings, this convening of minds, a convening of stakeholders. What we're actually talking about is ownership and recognition that we're not there yet in terms of mobilizing funds for the poorest women on the ground. Gareth, from the bank's perspective, I know you've talked a lot about the adaptation benefits mechanism, but how do we get the bank to recognize and take ownership, proper ownership of this problem?
Well, thank you very much indeed for having me here this afternoon, and Mary, thank you for your comments already. I'm already thinking about the acronyms, AC, Triple F, and VP Karaoke is saying, "Oh my goodness, not another fund," you know. But I know actually I can see this is certainly going somewhere. The African Development Bank is the premium financing institution on the continent, and one of the strongest things we have is our convening power. And I mean, this is a great suggestion to convene these groups that are working together and to pull out some of those lessons and to see where that goes. So, you know, I think that is something that we could, you know, that we could really focus on trying to make some progress. I think that's a really exciting proposition, and I'm sure there are many very positive lessons out there that we could build off and use to raise additional finance. I think, you know, the challenges that we face, I think we're coming to understand them better about the scale of the activities that need to be funded, the nature of them, the way that the current climate finance architecture doesn't really speak to the needs of women and youth, and also the 44 million micro, small and medium enterprises that are out there who struggle to access the kind of finance that they need. And, you know, well, it's great to hear that there are good projects going on the ground that we could scale up and replicate if we had additional access to additional finance.
Thank you, Gareth. And with that in mind, I'm going to turn to you, Merci. New ideas and new initiatives are so badly needed, and to learn from good examples of where finance has been mobilized. Can you give us an example of what you've seen as good finance for women, or have you not indeed seen any good examples? You can be quite honest. This is an open platform and an open forum.
Yes, yes.
So please speak your mind.
Very difficult to say that I have seen any good examples, especially from where I am coming from, and then also from where Stephen was doing his studies. However, we have read about very good examples elsewhere. So one of them is where you have women forming groups and then supporting themselves through this, what we call the village savings and loans. So women are mobilizing finances from their own sources to develop other alternative sources of income. And that is a very good example because in the landscape that I work in, the village savings and loan is about 80% women, and they are able to mobilize their own finance. Unfortunately, when it comes to accessing finance beyond what they have mobilized, then it becomes an issue because the bar is too high. The criteria that has been developed for them to get access to finance is too big, and then it becomes very difficult for them to get access. For example, they don't have access to land. So if getting access to land is a criteria, then it means that the women are not able to access. And they don't have voices, they don't have representatives. So all these bars and criteria are becoming a challenge for the women to access finance. So this is just even at the lower level. And then you can imagine what happens beyond, you know, when we are raising the bar high, and then up to the national, and then up to the climate finance, then it becomes very, very difficult. So these are the issues that are happening real on the ground. Although women are trying their best to get access, because of the challenges here and there, because of the difficulties, and then because they don't have the voice, because they are not well represented, because they are not participating in decision making, then it becomes a challenge for them to even have access. To bring onto the table their issues becomes a problem. They need to be represented by men. And how can men speak for women? They need to be represented by civil society organizations. Most of them are men. So they don't really see the real issues that women are having, the real challenges and their real needs. So it becomes very difficult for the women to have. So very little examples, very little good examples are there, but I believe that we are making it gradually as the conversation continues.
Thank you, Merci. And before I turn to Stephen, who's going to get into the heart of the matter here, Mary, can I just ask you to reflect on what Merci has said. This really is an issue of injustice. It's not about the volume and the big amounts of money that are out there, but women are being represented by men. Their voices are not heard. This is an issue of climate injustice for sure. Mary.
Yes, I think it's very good that we bear in mind the layers of injustice, and the gender injustice is a very real factor. And a lot of it is, as Merci said, it's men who tend to get the positions, it's men who tend to represent a community or speak at the decision making. You know, when I had my mandate for the Great Lakes in Africa, I actually went out of my way. I'd meet with civil society, and it would be mainly the men, whether it was in Goma or in Kinshasa or in other parts of, who would speak. And I would say to the men, now please get out, I want to have a meeting with women only. And then I would hear, but that shouldn't be the case.
Yeah.
You know, it shouldn't have to be a protected space of women only. And more, especially young women, young climate activists, young women are really, you know, insisting and speaking out. Sorry, I do keep moving the mic. I do apologize. I'll be good. I'll learn my lesson. You were very good, by the way, Merci. What I think is important is to try to have as many of the authentic voices at things like this COP. I see two of my friends down there, one from Kenya, one from Uganda, waving. You know, their voices at the COP, and they have spoken out and spoken very well, are far more effective than my voice, frankly. You know, because they speak from the lived experience. And you know, I've seen negotiators put down their pen and start to listen to this lived experience and how serious it is and how unjust it is and how it needs to be. And we don't hear that enough.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think if we could make sure that we had really inclusive COPs, which we haven't up to now, that would help, because we'd hear the very voices we need to hear, indigenous voices, the voices of people with disabilities, the voices of very marginalized, very poor women.
Yeah.
You know, that's what we need to hear.
Yeah, and they're exactly the voices that we need to turn to, indeed, when we do some lesson learning, as you suggested, and hear from the ground in terms of how we can change the finance architecture to mobilize finance and then get those perspectives from the ground. Stephen, you've been sitting very quietly, very patiently. Now, this is someone who's spent the last 6 years working on his thesis behind the scenes while working at the UNDP, and he's really touched on issues of accountability, transparency, and how finance is stuck. Stephen, do you want to unpack what you found?
All right, so thank you very much for having me here, and it's a great privilege to have you here, Mary. And I would indeed say that my thesis or my research area was actually founded based on the earlier work that your foundation and your principles actually established. So I would like to dedicate that to you as well, that you have really influenced or shaped the way and manner in which my research questions were being thrown out for the participants to respond to. So thank you very much for that pioneering role. But the question that really stuck to me over the period that I was studying my PhD was to understand, I mean, how are we able, are climate finance actually getting to those who are really in need of climate finance to change their needs? The very poor on the ground, the women groups on the ground. How is the global finance architecture put in such a manner that the finance can get to those who are really in need of that? But I took a step back to understand what would drive a country to implement climate change adaptation intervention. What would drive an African country who contribute very less to the impact of climate change? What would drive them to do that? Because I contribute less to climate change. Why would I have to take an intervention to address the climate change? That was one of the fundamental questions that I wanted to understand. And I came to a realization that there are about 4 or 3 principal reasons why a nation who is contributing less to the impact of climate change will take climate change adaptation measure. One, it was based on the role or the influence of the donor community. Whatever the donor community says is what the government will do. What is it that the global framework or the climate funds that have been extra, what is it that they are saying them to do? That is what the country thought that they would do, but not really about the fact that the vulnerability of the people is what is actually driving them to take climate change interventions on ground. So I tried to find out. It's so clear that climate financing or climate adaptation financing from the Climate Change Adaptation Gap report and several analytical reports, it is clear that climate finance flow to Africa or to those who are really in need of it is limited. It's inadequate. It is not enough. That is clear. There's no question about that. But I really wanted to understand, even the little resources that come into the African countries, what mechanisms are put in place to ensure those little resources get to those who are really in need of it. And it is interesting to indicate that there are no effective mechanisms that are put in place to ensure that the little resources that we mobilize from climate adaptation funds, from vertical funds, from bilateral development funds, there is no mechanism put in place to ensure that a very poor woman that is living in a very remote area suffering from the adverse impact of climate change to get access to it, there is no mechanism put in place. The mechanisms put in place are so weak, they are not transparent enough to ensure that the little resources that are driven get to those who are really in need of climate finance to change their climate change adaptation measures. So little resources come through climate funds, little resources come from bilateral funds, but no system is put in place to ensure that those that are really in need of it gets to them. That's one of the things that I found out. But of course, one of the discussions that I've had was also to find out whether or not the global architecture itself, the financing architecture itself, doesn't reinforce climate injustice. And if you look at the investment criteria of most of the funds that has been established, I'm happy that the African Development Bank is coming to establish another fund, but the investment criteria that is put up by those funds are such that it seeks to reinforce injustice already. One of them will say the country needs. What are the country needs? Who are those benefiting from it? Are the people really involved in it? So a government will say that these are the priorities of the government, but they're not the priorities of those who are actually facing the adverse impact of climate change. So the investment criteria would have to put in such a manner such that it addresses the injustice at the community level. So that's one of the things that I found, that the global funds that are set up is reinforcing climate injustice because it meets country needs, but it does not really meet the needs of the people on ground. Why? How did I come to that conclusion? Because if it indeed is the priority of the country, it is the needs of the country, then the political manifestos, the political agenda must take into consideration issues of climate change. I did a content analysis, and it came to the realization that no mention of issues of climate change was mentioned in any of the political agendas. So how does the needs of the country become the needs of the people that are suffering from the adverse impact of climate change? So the people that are suffering from the impact of climate change are not involved in the policy decision making. They're not involved in the resource allocation. They're not involved in the distribution of the resource itself. And if global funds or funds are set up and without taking into consideration those issues, we will continue to reinforce the climate injustice that is happening around the world. So these are some of the findings, the issues that I actually got out from my findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Very, very, very powerful insights, and you've articulated that so very clearly. And with your findings, I'm going to turn directly to Gareth. The 3 points that Stephen has articulated very well: there's no transparency, there is no accountability, the investment criteria is all wrong, and there's no way of tracking the funds that are mobilized, and there's no mention of climate justice and the needs of people. Can you reflect on what Stephen has found through his extensive work, and how do we address these huge items?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. And Stephen, that was very interesting to listen to your the results of your work. And I would very much agree. I think can you hear me? So we should be clear. I mean, there is also a very important role about mitigation finance, and we need to continue providing funding for mitigation. But definitely there is insufficient money coming for adaptation activities, and particularly the kinds of small-scale and context-specific adaptation actions that women and youth would implement. Now, I want to tell you briefly about the idea behind the adaptation benefits mechanism.
Hold it to the yeah.
I'm almost eating it.
Yeah.
Well, I think I can't get much closer to it. The purpose or the idea behind the adaptation benefits mechanism is that We invite donors and developed country consumers to contribute towards the costs of adaptation projects through the purchase of certified adaptation benefits. So if I put that another way, you may have heard recently from some large names, Carney and Kerry in particular, encouraging voluntary carbon markets and more activity in that space. Well, we would say, as well as buying voluntary carbon credits, buy certified adaptation benefits and channel that money directly to the kinds of projects that you want to support on the ground. Now, what's interesting about that is that the ABM is not a fund, it's a mechanism. So you set up the criteria, you choose the projects that you want to invest in. You're not coming through an international climate fund like the Green Climate Fund or the Global Environment Facility where the criteria are established. Secondly, it's very much designed to promote transparency. We will provide a narrative with every single certified adaptation benefit that says this is the amount of money that was received, this is the amount of additional finance that was mobilized, and this is a description of the impacts and outputs and outcomes that that money contributed to. So the transparency and the accountability is there. And finally, the tracking will come because donor governments will use that money to report, or that information to report as their contribution towards the adaptation needs in the recipient country, and the recipient country will report those as support received. So through the transparency framework, we have a means of tracking and reporting the climate finance.
Can I ask you specifically, Gareth, and I'd like to hear what Stephen and Mary and Merci think about this idea of making sure that there are climate justice indicators embedded within, whether it's an adaptation benefits mechanism or any other way of financial flows to those who need it. Because what Stephen is saying is that issues of injustice are not there, they're not tabled, and if they're not tabled, you cannot report on progress in terms of justice or even injustice. So we actually don't know how people are benefiting or not benefiting. It's so important that these principles are anchored in these approaches.
So, look, I mean, I agree, and there's certainly plenty of examples of funds that don't address those needs. I think we're getting better. For example, at the African Development Bank, we now mainstream gender throughout all of our projects, and there's a full gender mapping exercise. So we're becoming increasingly aware. I'm sure we haven't gone far enough yet. If we take the idea of a feminist finance fund, I mean, that would take things to a new level. We have 2 funds at the African Development Bank that are supported by the Global Affairs Canada. As you may know, they have an affirmative feminist action international policy, FIAP, which requires that we ensure that women are positively included in those projects. So that money is now being directed in a positive way towards gender-aware activities, and that's setting a really good example. Also, the concept of just transition is pushing us to identify all of the sectors of society who benefit from funding, and also those who are impacted by funding. So the concept of just transition will help in that respect. So I think, you know, we are at the start of this journey. I think we're learning all the time, and there are some very important steps that we need to take. And events like this are really helping to bring those points to the fore.
Thank you, Gareth. Before I turn to Stephen and Merci, Mary, what would you like to see in terms of a set of indicators and finance structures? What is important here?
First of all, I think this is the second time that we've been together on a panel, and you were speaking about this adaptation benefits mechanism last time. Has it started? How much money?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay.
Still working to raise the
All right, my next question, when? Anyway, well, at least to your point, to your question, Tanzina, can you hear me?
Yep.
To your question, at least this does give time to think about the kind of criteria, to think about the barriers to women Many women on the ground want quite small amounts in order to grow. They don't deal with climate, the Green Climate Fund or the big thing. How will the adaptation benefits mechanism be more user-friendly? How will the, even knowing about it, be more made known? How will it be possible to make sure in a community that the most marginalized are not left out? And that, you know, all of these would be factors. And I'm sure our PhD student would have more factors to include. I think probably the most important of all is when you're designing, because you obviously are not yet ready to launch, how much consultation are you having with women's organizations, with civil society, with women's groups, with communities? Because that will also help. You know, even some of the people here could, you know, give you some really good ideas.
Yeah. Thank you, Mary. I'm going to come to Stephen for the last, for his remarks. Okay. Stephen, what do you want to see? And then I'll ask Merci whether she thinks that's realistic or not. Okay. Stephen, what do you want to see?
Okay, so in developing countries like, say, Ghana, or in Africa in general, of course, there's limited financing for most of the development work in general, and more particularly on issues of climate adaptation and mitigation. So, and the accessing financing, whether from any of the funds, usually becomes a bit very difficult. The project preparation grants are usually not there. So, and that is why most of the time it becomes a bit very difficult for extensive consultation to be made to those who are really facing the adverse impact of climate change. So, in my opinion, and from the findings of the research, which suggestion that I'm making, of course, it is important that we identify or define specific set of indicators that can be measured. If there are no indicators, you cannot measure the progress that we are making towards ensuring just transition. So I would say that whether it is a loan that the African Development Bank is going to provide, or the World Bank, or from the climate funds, or any of the central funds that is being established, they must accompany with it climate just analysis. And let's have clear analysis right even from the program design stage, from the program implementation stage, and also from the monitoring and evaluation. At each stage of it, we need an analysis of the climate justice, so that will be the only way by which we can know that we are making progress towards achieving climate justice for all that are actually suffering from adverse impact of climate change. That's what I would say.
That's very, very, very practical. I can almost see the next stages of this feminist climate just fund taking shape already. it's very exciting. Merci, are you hearing some positive steps that we can work on and build on? So hopefully by COP28 we could maybe announce a climate just feminist fund with these principles to underpin. Merci, your thoughts?
Yes, I would say yes. I am really hearing some positive things. But just to add that in all these things, one of the key indicator will be how inclusive the whole process has been. I mentioned that currently we see men making decisions for women. So in getting indicators, then it means that we need to include the woman. If possible, it's the woman who should make the decision. They should identify the criteria. They should be involved in developing the indicators. They should know and then be able to know when and how a project can be identified as climate justice or not. So the women should be deeply involved in all stages, because we have passed the time when other people are making decisions for women, the poor, and the marginalized.
Thank you. That's so well said. We have a few minutes now to have some questions from our audience. So if you would like to ask some questions, please do raise your hand. There's a question at the back there. Can you maybe come to the front? I don't think we've got a roving mic. No. Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Titi Akosa. I'm the Executive Director of Center for 21st Century Issues, and I run a campaign called African Women for Climate Finance. And we are being supported in a way by the AFDB. Thank you for this. But one important thing we've been asking for is how do we keep the climate finance access process very simple for women? Because that is just the real problem we have. Yes, you announce big sums of money, but when it comes to getting it into the hands of those who need it, it becomes a complex process. And to some of us, we think that it's becoming a voodoo process. Yeah, it is becoming a voodoo process because they will ask you for log frames, they will ask you for indicators, they will ask you for all sorts of things, and then they will start their financial jargons. We women don't understand it. Can we break down this language so that we understand it? Can we listen to women? Can we listen to women when you are developing your financial mechanisms? All these mechanisms don't work for us. If you want a good financial mechanism that will work for women on the ground, then listen to us. Then we will tell you what we are experiencing and how this will work for us. And then please, we are begging you, keep it simple. We are tired of complex processes. Thank you.
That's very, very, very powerful. I'll take another question before I come to my panel. There was a hand here. Would you like to come to the front, or is there a...
Stay?
Yep, okay, go ahead.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you so much for your very, very meaningful intervention. I think we all agree that the process is a bit voodoo-ish. Where we come from in Jamaica, we call it obia. I want to make a plug about GFW. I heard pioneering stalwart Mary Robinson speak to GFW's process. I currently work with GFW as a consultant in the Caribbean on their movement-led approach process for feminist organizing and climate justice. And they're doing this work in the Caribbean and in the Pacific Islands as well. And I think it's a best practice for engaging women at the front lines at community levels around climate justice and financing. And I would like to suggest that it's a starting point, possibly, for the conversations that the bank is going to be having to bring partners together who are already working on this issue. So thank you for making mention to GFW, and I again want to put on record that they are doing this work, and I think is a good example of how you know, agencies that are looking to get into funding can actually do that in a meaningful way, engaging the partners at the lowest levels.
Thank you for that, and something that we'll definitely bear in mind. Is there another question? We take that question, and then we will get to the answers.
Good afternoon, everybody. Mine is not even a question, it's a comment. Nice to see you, Mary Robinson. And I just want to comment and say that from the time that President Mary Robinson started the Mary Robinson Just Foundation, walking that journey, there was a fund that was created, Climate Justice Resilience Fund. Please Google and find out more about Climate Justice Resilience Fund. And it's funding grassroots organizations. Some of us came here because of the Climate Justice Resilience Fund. And it's a very flexible and very friendly fund, unlike what my sister was talking about. And that is part of what we are here for, so that we can even mention things like that. You can actually Google about it, because now they've won a lot of trust from other funders because of the strategy that they employ. And that does not mean that we do not create more funding specifically for women. It does not mean that. Then again, I just want to mention that last year, during the Glasgow meeting, there was a fund that was created, 1.7 billion, to be given to indigenous communities. Maybe you've heard about it if you were here last year. And right now we're here to see, we launched it the other day, we want our own mechanism. How do we want this money to be given to us? We have a mechanism of our own. We want that money to go directly to where it shall be used well. We want it to go to the communities who are affected daily by climate change effects. So that is the kind of mechanism, Stephen, you are talking about. So we need to come, it's up to us. We cannot come here and complain and say there are no mechanisms, there is no this and that. It's us to say. That's why we have come here. We voice out and say this is what we want, and that's what we did this time round. We have launched that 1.7 billion, and we want it to be given in our own terms. not in the terms of other people. Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you for sharing that information insight. Let's just take the answer to the question that we had. How do we keep it simple, Merci? How do we keep funding simple? It's not a voodoo process. We've got to simplify this, right?
Thank you very much for bringing this up. So that's exactly what I have been saying, that it should be by the woman for the woman. The women know how to understand simple things, and they know how to make it simple. So for all these things, I think that the women should be at the center stage. They will be able to make things simple for themselves. They will be able to address issues when they are simple. And to the donor communities, as much as possible, I agree with her very, very much that when we have those jargons, then it becomes difficult.
Yeah.
It narrows down the space for women.
Yeah.
So simplicity is very, very important. They are the worst affected. They lived very simple lives. And for that reason, as much as possible, wherever the funding is coming from, wherever the projects and programs are coming from, let's, as much as possible, simplify things so that women are able to assess, so that they are able to meet the criteria, so that they are able to meet the standards, and then they are able to also to monitor and evaluate by themselves.
Thank you, Merci. I'm just looking at the time, and I think we're almost run out of time, but I think I would like to give the final thought to Mary. Mary, we've had COP26. This is now COP27. What kind of discussion would you like to see happening COP28 when we convene again? And Gareth is looking at me frowning already. How are we going to push the African Development Bank into new heights?
Well, first of all, Tashin, to be honest, I think I admire the fact that you are persistent on this topic. This is our second time. If we have a discussion at COP28, we will build. We're building already. I hope there will have been a convening, because there are other, I agree the Climate Resilience Fund, which is relatively new, the Climate Justice Resilience Fund is a great fund, supported by the Oak Foundation. But there's also, there's Mama Cash, there's Frida, which is a young feminist fund, there's a Fiji feminist fund. There are things. The problem is they don't have big resources.
Yes.
But they have learning of how to reach and how to keep it simple and how to manage. And that's where I think there would be a benefit to the African Development Bank and indeed the other multinational banks. They all should be doing what the African Development Bank is doing and have a same real commitment to try to fund what women are doing on the ground. We've seen in Glasgow a commitment to double adaptation funds by 2025. That's another 40 billion. But there's no pathway to it at the moment.
No.
It's the old story. It's talk without implementation. We need to get really serious. And what I'm kind of seeing is outside the UNFCCC, there's big talk now about the fact that countries like Africa, continents like Africa, need $1 trillion, not small money. And a lot of that will have to go on to women on the ground. I think we need to link what's happening in a G20 context and a World Bank IMF context. The report of the advisory group to G20 has really important new ideas of how to greatly enlarge the amount the World Bank and the IMF can provide in real money into the system to deal with the climate crisis. So we shouldn't be, in a narrow siloed way, only talking about the UNFCCC. We should be talking about the banks like the African Development Bank, but the other multilateral banks as well. And then, when we enlarge what money is there, we still have to keep the principle. I couldn't agree more with what the representative of the Africa Women for Climate Finance said, that we need to keep it simple. And Merci has echoed that very strongly. you know, it is kept simple by all the other funders. The Grameen Bank keeps it simple. Trust money, trust loans to women. You know, what Mohammed Yunus is doing, trust women. It's not complicated, you know, but it needs a new mentality of approach, which the still relatively male-dominated large banks don't necessarily have, but it's coming. Most of them now are talking about having a strong gender policy, as you've spoken about the Africa Development Bank. You cannot justify having a strong gender policy if you don't get money to women on the ground. It's as simple as that.
Thank you, Mary. I think that's, I mean, just from what you said, you've actually posed a huge challenge to us. Mary, you're very good at posing challenges. I'm getting accustomed to that, and it keeps us pushing and pushing along. And I think what we'll do is we'll take away the findings from this discussion, and we've got some very clear bullet points that we want to work on over the next year. So hopefully we'll have a different set of conversations next year. But I would like to just express my sincere thanks to all my panelists, Mary Robinson, Gareth Philips, Merci and Stephen. Thank you so much for joining us, and to you, our audience, for listening into this conversation. And we will really adhere to what Mary is saying and keep the pressure up. And we are persistent in this conversation, and we will continue it, and we will convene again at COP28 and see where we're going. But for now, I just want to thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of COP, and a very good evening to you all.
Well done.
Thank you.
Yeah. I thought they have something here too, but yeah. I think I will ask if he's coming. Oh, that one, maybe, no, maybe this one is the one off. Yeah. Then you can stay here and then, yeah.
Yeah, because for some reason I thought I wouldn't be able to see either of them, but I can see that one. I see both.
Oh, you can also turn it this way. If you want, yeah.
No, that's okay. I think it looks good.
Nobody sees, so for presentation, you can see, yeah. I think you can, yeah. Yes.